Barack Obama has called him his little brother. For the first 3 years of his presidency, from the inauguration to the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, Reggie Love stood at the US president's side in public and in private as his closest personal aide, his body man, his so-called chief of staff. So what was President Obama like when the cameras stopped rolling? And how did he cope with the pressures of the presidency, from crises at home to wars abroad? Reggie Love joins me now on UpFront. Thank you so much for taking time out.
Eddie, thank you for having me. Excited to be here today.
Having spent so much time at Obama's side with him in private, when the cameras are switched off, when journalists aren't watching, what quality about him that you think the public doesn't get, doesn't see, that you wish they'd seen more of over the past 8 years?
That's a great question. And I think in the last few years, you got a lot of people who were sort of like critical of him because he was not like Bill Clinton. He was like, oh, he's aloof, or whatever the critics were saying. And I think there was an element that comparatively they didn't take into consideration, was that Barack Obama had 2 small daughters when he got to be the president of the United States. And one of the things that was really important to him was he wanted to be a father who was there. He wanted to be a great husband and a great father.
You say aloofness, and people have talked about him being aloof. A lot of people have observed the president's, you might call it aloofness, some call it coolness, others say zen-like demeanor. His fans call him no drama Obama. How accurate is that description of him in your view? Is he someone who really never lost it, not even in private?
No, I mean, look, I think, the guy's very rational, right? But everyone has an irrational moment here and there. But I think in terms of how he makes decisions, I don't think he's one of these folks that, because I had a harsh response to something or harsh reaction to something, that my decision in dealing with that process is not also going to be harsh as well. It's really more, okay, let me process it, let me understand it. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities to make this better than what it currently is today?
You were in the White House the day Osama bin Laden was killed in May 2011. What was it like? What was the president like at that time? I mean, just the night before, Obama was doing jokes at Donald Trump's expense at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, wasn't he? And the next day, this massive, historic moment in his presidency happens.
I remember the day, and it was a historical day, I think, for our country and for his presidency. I think one of the hardest parts of the job is sort of understanding that the decisions you make oftentimes have big impacts in terms of the effect on life, right? You are men and women who serve the United States to protect freedom and to protect our democracy. It's tough to have to make those types of decisions, and it's a challenge that you face throughout the entire presidency, whether it's Osama bin Laden, whether it's how you're dealing with things in Libya or Iran or whatever.
Well, a lot of people, a lot of liberals like Obama. They see him as a good guy, a decent guy who stood up for the little guy. He brought in healthcare, fought for equal pay, wanted a higher minimum wage. Yeah. But a lot of people at the same time on the left here in the US, in a lot of countries around the world, they look at Obama and they say, this is a guy who killed hundreds of civilians, including US citizens via drone strikes, who failed to prosecute CIA torturers, who helped put Chelsea Manning in solitary confinement, who had no problem with NSA surveillance until Edward Snowden came along and exposed it, etc., etc., etc. How do you deal with that disconnect between the guy you knew personally, the good guy, family man, and the guy who was taking decisions, which often were very bad decisions, which led to bloodshed, which led to innocents being killed? How do you deal with that?
Look, I think, I respect the president, and I respect every decision he's ever made, and I think, no one else can sort of bear the load or the burden that it comes with making these decisions. I think every decision he made, I think he weighed carefully, and I think that at the point in time in which he made the decision, I don't doubt that that decision was something that he thought was going to be the best for moving our country forward. And to get it right 100% of the time, it would just be, that's the hope, but it's not always the case.
You've written about how race was a reason the president leaned so much on you. You wrote in your book about your time in the White House, no matter what, he knew he could trust me. I was the only other brother working on the first floor of the West Wing in the bubble every day. Was there really just the two of you at that time? I mean, doesn't that reflect badly also on President Obama for not appointing more black people to senior positions in administration? He has Susan Rice now as a national security advisor. Yeah. But back then, if you're saying it was just you and him.
No, I mean, look, I said, so the point that I made was that in the West Wing, you had, you know, a very small amount of spots, right? In terms of diversity throughout the entire administration, I think he was great on it, right? I think you had guys like Eric Holder, you had Lisa Jackson, you had Nancy Sutley, you had a huge amount of diversity throughout the entire Obama administration.
Do you think he did enough on diversity?
Look, I think you can always try to figure out how to be a little more diverse, right? You know, whether it's color, whether it's gender, whether it's, you know, sexuality. I think you can always sort of work at it. And I think, you know, as we progress, you know, and as we become more accepting of these things, I think a lot of places are going to look more like Canada than they do, you know, currently. There are a lot of black community leaders, scholars, activists who are disappointed in the record of America's first black president. They point to the fact, for example, that the wealth gap between white America and black America actually went up on Obama's watch. How much does it weigh on his conscience as he does his own internal audit of the past 8 years? You know, what's happened to black America? Yeah. You know, I think he was especially concerned with people from Americans and black America. When you look at, you know, all the things that he and Secretary Holder had done to look at how local law enforcement agencies were assessing and processing their systems, when you look at what he did for healthcare, when you look at the Recovery Act as a whole and how you save, you know, our economy from sort of the total brink, you know, people who look like me, brown folks, you know, they're the ones who would have been the most affected by a collapse in the economy.
I mean, how distraught is he that his legacy now, from Obamacare at home to the Iran deal abroad, could all be torn up?
It is a challenge. I don't think that Donald Trump will have the capabilities to dismantle it piece by piece. I think they will have a really good opportunity to make it what they think it should be. But to say that you're going to take away something that people have had for the last 6 years and turn it into nothing and give people nothing, I think it'll be very challenging.
Reggie Love, thanks for joining me on the show.
Maddie, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.